All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Genesis. In this recording, we are going to look at Genesis chapters 37 through 47. That's right, it's a big chunk. And really, in working through the Old Testament, there's going to be plenty of times where we take bigger chunks like this because I'm trying to just provide maybe a guide and a direction for helping us read some of these books well and wisely. So that's what we're going to do here. So this section, Genesis 37 through 47, is labeled as the Toledot of Jacob. In other words, it is the section that's about Jacob's sons. We've mentioned this word Toledot, Hebrew word, multiple times in our study of Genesis, and it's always a chance to look at whoever is named, their descendants, their offspring. So this is the Toledot of Jacob, focusing on his sons, but really the focus is going to be on his 11th son, Joseph, the firstborn son of Rachel. The story also has a strong secondary focus on Judah, who is Jacob's fourth son. And we're not going to read all 10 of these chapters. What I want to do is just give you some tips and guidelines for reading this section well. So let's begin by reviewing Jacob and the birth of his sons. Recall that Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, but his uncle Laban tricked him by giving him Leah and then giving him Rachel after that. And Rachel struggled to get pregnant, but Leah had sons, and that led to all sorts of jealousy and rivalry that ensued, with Rachel giving Jacob her servant to have sons that way, and then that led to Leah giving her servant to Jacob, and then eventually Rachel finally had a son, and that son was Joseph, and he's going to be the focus of this section. And so all of that was in the earlier chapters about Jacob in Genesis. So here are the sons of each of these women. So Leah's sons are Reuben, the very firstborn son, and then Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then later down the line, she also gave birth to Issachar and Zebulun. Leah's female servant, her name was Zilpah, and her sons born to Jacob are Gad and Asher. Then Rachel's sons are Joseph and Benjamin, and Bilhah is Rachel's female servant, and her sons born to Jacob are Dan and Naphtali. And the birth order, to put these sons' names in birth order, it looks like this: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. That's the birth order for Jacob's 12 sons. And so in the story, as we've read it in Genesis, Rachel is Jacob's first love, and Joseph was her son, with Benjamin being a son born later to her in life, and she died as a result of his birth. So Genesis 37 through 47 is the story of Jacob's family, Jacob's sons, focused particularly on Joseph and Joseph's impact on all the other brothers. The way Tim Mackey of the Bible Project puts it is, this is clearly a story about a family fracturing apart through jealousy, anger, and betrayal, but it also shows how those betrayals end up becoming the vehicle for the purposes of God in and through this family. All right, that is sort of the backdrop against which these chapters, 37 through 47, are written. Now, let's just talk a few things concerning literary structure and aim or intent of this section. First off, this story about Joseph, and if you've read Genesis before, you know it's a well-known and famous story. This story is important. In fact, just the sheer scope and size of this story covers over 20% of the book of Genesis, which tells how important it is. And it's important for a couple reasons. First of all, it shows, once again, God protecting the promise, protecting it both from the bad behavior of the family of promise, Jacob and his sons, as well as protecting it from the threat, in this case particularly, of famine and some of the other things that get in the way along the way. It also shows how Jacob's family, which becomes the people of Israel, ended up in Egypt. And that's where Volume 2, the book of Exodus in the Pentateuch, is going to pick up with Israel and Egypt. How did they end up there? Why did they end up there? How did they get so large there? Well, we would have none of that without this story that focuses on Joseph and his brothers. Not only that, this story comes to us in, if you will, in three scenes. The first scene is the early rise and fall of Joseph. He's the favored son. He has dreams about rising to supremacy, but then he ends up being sold to slave traders. A little bit more about that in a bit. The second scene is then Joseph in Egypt. And it's another rise and fall and rise again story about Joseph in Egypt. And then the third scene in this sequence concerns Joseph and his reconnection with and reuniting and reconciliation with his brothers. So that's the breakdown. The early life of Joseph, Joseph in Egypt, and then Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers. Now, let's give a summary and overview of the story of Joseph here in Genesis 37 through 47 so that we at least understand what's going on. As we noted, this section is labeled the Toledot of Jacob. So chapter 37 verse 1 says, "Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had lived as a stranger in the land of Canaan." He's still an outsider. He's still a foreigner. These are the records. This is the Toledot of Jacob. It's the account of his descendants, but again, we said it's very selective, focusing particularly on this lens, looking through Joseph and his relationship with his brothers and how the whole family ends up in Egypt. So, scene one of that story is the early rise and fall of Joseph. And the story in Genesis 37 picks up when Joseph is 17. And remember, he is son number 11 out of 12. So, all the other brothers that are involved in this story, they're older than he is. And the setting, what leads to the tension of the story, is the jealousy and rivalry between Joseph and his older brothers. It's clear to everyone that Joseph is Jacob's favorite. In fact, his dad even gave him this spectacular, colorful robe that made it just stand out how favored he was. And his brothers absolutely can't stand him. Then Joseph has dreams, and you can read the chapter about the nature of the dreams, but he has these dreams which indicate that he is somehow going to ascend to supremacy over his brothers. In fact, even his father is going to bow down before him. And that's going to happen even though he's younger than all of them. And so because of all of this, his brothers absolutely despise him. And then one day, the brothers are all out tending to the family flocks. It's sort of free-range pasturing. And so Jacob wants Joseph to go out and check on his brothers. And he knows the last place they've been where they're letting the sheep and goats graze. So Joseph goes out to find his brothers. Eventually, he finds them. They've moved on to a different place by the time he gets there. But he goes, he finds them. They're a long way from home. And the brothers figure this is their chance to get rid of him. So initially, after seizing Joseph, there's talk about killing him. Eventually, through a course of events, they decide not to kill him, but they've thrown him into a pit. And it just so happens that a band of traders come along. And so what they decide to do is, let's not kill him, but let's sell him to these traders. But they do that, take his colorful robe, put some goat's blood on it, and then they tell Jacob, his dad, that Joseph had been killed. And so off Jacob goes with these traders. The traders sell him as a slave to an official in Egypt. And it doesn't look anything like these visions of grandeur, these visions of greatness from Joseph's dreams like he had in mind. But he ends up being in Egypt, working for a high-ranking official and actually doing quite well. In fact, so well in Egypt that he is actually put in charge of this high-ranking official's household. He becomes the household manager over all the household because he does so well in Egypt. Now, that's where chapter 37 breaks off. And Moses then does something very interesting and important. He pauses the story of Joseph and Joseph's life in Egypt for chapter 38. And he pauses that story and cuts to a scene about one of his older brothers, Judah, who's a decent amount older than Joseph. He's brother number 4. And by this point, Judah has sons who have married. And the story in chapter 38 concerns Judah, his sons, and his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Now, we'll tell a little bit more about that story here in a little bit. But the key thing to note right now is it seems that part of the reason for the interruption in the Joseph story is because Judah becomes a key secondary player in what happens in the rest of the story about Joseph and his brothers as it unfolds. So we get a little pause and interlude in 38 because we need to see something about Judah that happens there. We'll talk more about that in a second. So that's scene 1. It's the early rise and fall of Joseph. He's the favored son. His brothers despise him, and they sell Joseph to some traders, and he ends up working for a high-ranking official in Egypt. Scene 1. Scene 2 picks up with Joseph in Egypt. And Joseph excels in Egypt. He is actually quite capable and quite competent as a person, but that's not really why he excels. In fact, Moses is very clear in how he tells the story of Joseph's time in Egypt that he excels because God was with him, especially in chapter 39. That gets mentioned repeatedly. We'll look at that when we look at some theological themes below. But God's with Joseph in Egypt, and God blesses him. And Joseph had great success in Egypt. But then the story takes a crazy turn. Again, you need to read this section of Genesis because it's really a fun and exciting read. And so here's what happens. Joseph is working for Potiphar, a high-ranking military official who is the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, and he keeps refusing and resisting, which again demonstrates his trustworthiness and his character. But she keeps trying until finally, in one of her attempts, she grabs his cloak. It falls off in her hands. So then she accuses him in her anger at him. She accuses him of trying to rape her. And then Joseph is thrown into prison. So here he is. He's come in as a servant. He's worked through the ranks. He's proven his competence. He's come to a high position. And now once again, he implodes and crashes down through no fault of his own. And he ends up being thrown into prison. But once again, God is with him, even in prison. And the head of the jail ends up putting Joseph in charge of the jail. He, again, demonstrates his trustworthiness and his competency, and he actually becomes like the key steward of the official who's in charge of the entire jail. And Joseph ends up spending 2 years in prison, not just a few weeks, 2 years, through something he didn't do. Now, you have to read the story for how he ends up getting out, but it involves more dreams, Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, so that he eventually ends up interpreting a dream for Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream that troubles him, and Joseph interprets that dream for him. And Pharaoh's dream, it involves some corn stalks and some cattle, and it indicates that there's going to be 7 rich years that are coming, where there's going to be plenty of produce, plenty of good years for the land of Egypt, but that's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph interprets this dream for Pharaoh and suggests a plan to prepare Egypt for the famine. And Pharaoh likes the plan. And what he decides to do is put Joseph in charge of executing that plan. And so Joseph now is brought out of prison, and he rises to power in Egypt, and he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man in Egypt. And that leads then into scene chapter 3, where this famine has spread throughout that whole region. Joseph's family up north in Canaan, they're feeling the effects of the famine. So Jacob sends some of Joseph's brothers down to Egypt because he's heard that there's actually grain available in Egypt. So they go down to Egypt. They end up buying some grain. Joseph recognizes his brothers. His brothers don't recognize him. And through a whole bunch of interactions and subterfuge, eventually it leads to Joseph announcing to his brothers who he is, that he is Joseph, their brother, who has been sent here ahead of them. That's the story in a nutshell that leads to Joseph being reconciled with his brothers after a couple decades. Now, it's a fun and exciting, a little bit crazy story to read, so you'll have to read these chapters to get all the details, but that's the story in a nutshell. Now, as you read it, here are a few things to pay attention to. The first is some of the key themes or patterns of Genesis that has showed up in earlier chapters. Well, they show up once again here. So, for example, this idea of favoritism and then jealousy and conflict. The theme of the younger over the older shows up in the Joseph story. The character flaws of the family of promise, Abraham's family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's descendants, and all their shortcomings and character flaws, once again, they reemerge here in this story. And God's ability to protect the promise and carry the promise forward in spite of all the obstacles, all the threats, and even all the failures of the family of promise. God has this ability to carry it forward. And that's really the culminating idea of the Joseph story. The second thing to pay attention to as you read through this story is, even though the story focuses on Joseph, we've noted it has a strong secondary focus on Judah. So as you read through the story, you should pay attention to Judah. We get a whole chapter on him in chapter 38. And then you get, after that, mentions of Judah at various points throughout the story. So pay attention to what's said about Judah and what Judah does, because it all becomes very important later on towards the end of Genesis when Jacob pronounces his patriarchal blessings on his 12 sons. What we see happening in this story with Judah explains why Judah, the fourthborn, gets a promotion. The royal line's going to come from him. And Reuben, the firstborn, gets a demotion. And all of this is played out very subtly and implicitly in this narrative. So as you read these chapters, look for the presence and the actions of Judah. I'm pretty certain that's why we have 37 setting up the story of Joseph, and then chapter 38 interrupting and pausing that story to talk about Judah. Now, as you read chapter 38, just a couple little things to pay attention to as you read that whole chapter about Judah. It's a really wild and weird chapter. And as you read it, what you need to bear in mind is this whole idea of levirate marriage in the ancient world. This was an important cultural practice, not only for Jacob's family, but just for Near Eastern families. And it was a way of preserving family lines and family lands. And what it meant was, if you gave your son in marriage to somebody else, and he died before she had produced legitimate heirs or offspring to secure the family line and the family land, then what you needed to do was give the next son, who's not married, to her as well, so that these two could be married and legitimate heirs could be produced. That's the cultural practice that sets the stage for what happens in chapter 38. And that's why we read that and we hear that practice. That is just weird. But in their culture, that was not weird. It was right. It's what you did in order to produce heirs and protect this woman who is widowed without any heirs to take care of her. And so that's why in chapter 38, Tamar gets passed from Judah's first son to his second son, who dies as well without any heirs. And it's why Judah is like dragging his feet on giving her in marriage to his third son, because like, my son keeps marrying this woman and they keep dying. What's wrong with that? And he doesn't want to lose another son. And so he drags his feet. That leads to the tension and what happens in chapter 38. You'll have to read it to see what all happens. But while all of that is weird to modern ears, for her, it means that Jacob is not doing right by her. He's treating her badly. That's why she experiences what she does in chapter 38 as a great injustice. It's also why, in the plot twist at the end of chapter 38, Jacob says, she, Tamar, is more righteous than he is. Now, as you read through chapter 38, again, it's a bit of a wild story, but it seems to be a moment in Judah's life that changes him. And what we begin to see in the subtle, implicit ways Judah shows up in the rest of the Joseph story is a changed man, or a man who is changing. And Judah is becoming more self-giving. He is stepping forward and taking more responsibility and trying to do what's right by the family a whole lot more. And so this story in chapter 38, I think, is there intentionally to set the stage for why Judah becomes the man he becomes and why he gets the promotion by Jacob in the patriarchal blessing later in Genesis. So pay attention to Judah. A third thing to pay attention to as you read through these chapters is pay attention to the idea. One of the elements of the promise was that Abraham's family would be a blessing to the nation. Well, here in Genesis 37 through 47, we begin to see, at least like so many of the other things, like maybe initial, beginning fulfillments of that, little fulfillments of Abraham's family bringing a blessing to the nation. And here it shows up in Joseph's wisdom during the famine and how it provides for the people of Egypt, but not only the people of Egypt, his own family and people from the other surrounding lands. And so, as we've seen, the initial fulfillment of things like you're going to have descendants like the stars of the sky, or we've seen initial fulfillments for you're going to own this land, it's going to be the land of promise, and there's little incipient beginnings of those promises coming to fulfillment. Well, we see this promise, this part of the promise coming to fulfillment as well, where Jacob's family is becoming a blessing to the nations around them in Joseph's wisdom in providing food during a famine. And then finally, the fourth thing to pay attention to as you read through this section, and it's really the main thing, the main theological theme, if you will. It's like the key faith lesson we're supposed to learn from these chapters, and that is pay attention, number 4, to God being with Joseph. In the end, Joseph's dreams that he had at the very beginning of the story do come to reality. He does ascend to a place of primacy. His brothers literally bow down before him. But it's only by God's providence and God's faithfulness. It's not by Joseph's superiority. It's not by Joseph's conniving or manipulation or Joseph making it happen. Joseph actually seems to learn that. And he sees that in the end, that yes, he's in this position, but he's only in this position by God's sovereign goodness. And so Joseph is 17 in chapter 37 at the outset of the story when he first has these dreams. We're told later in the story, at the beginning of the 7 good years, the rich years, that he's 30. And then when he reunites with his brothers, the 7 bad years have been going for 2 years, which means by that point, Joseph is 39. These 10 chapters cover about 22 years of Joseph's life. And Joseph's been through a lot. And he's been humbled and tempered and changed. And he's now very aware of God's sovereign goodness in his life. And that's crucial for us to pay attention to as we read through this story. So as you read down, for example, through chapter 39, note how often it says the Lord was with him. It shows up right at the beginning of chapter 39 verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph so that he became a successful man. And then that's actually restated in the very next verse, 39:3, when it says, the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. It's by God's design that Joseph is succeeding in Egypt. It's because God is with him. Even when he goes to prison in Egypt in chapter 39, it says in 39:21, but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. And then towards the end of chapter 39 in verse 23, it says, the warden of the prison did not supervise anything under Joseph's authority. Why? Because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made whatever he did prosper. This is a key theme and a key faith lesson for us out of the book of Genesis in the story of Joseph. In fact, the dreams that Joseph interprets that eventually lead to him rising to power in Egypt, well, Joseph attributes the ability to interpret those dreams to God himself, not to Joseph himself. You see that when Joseph says this in chapter 40, verse 8, when he says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dream. And Joseph goes on then to interpret the dreams of a couple of these fellow prisoners there in prison with him. That eventually leads him to interpreting Pharaoh's dream. And Joseph says this when he goes to interpret Pharaoh's dream in chapter 41, verse 16. He says, Joseph then answered Pharaoh saying, it has nothing to do with me. God will give Pharaoh an answer for his own good. Or again, in chapter 41, verse 25, and Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he's about to do. And then he interprets the dream. And so all of this comes from God's hand. And Joseph is learning that as he grows and matures through what he goes through while he's in Egypt. In fact, when Joseph finally announces his identity to his brothers, that he's Joseph in chapter 45, this is what he says to them, Genesis 45, verse 5. Now, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for, listen, God sent me ahead of you to save lives. And then he says that the famine's been very hard, there's been no food, but 45 verse 7, so God sent me here ahead of you to ensure for you a remnant of the earth. In verse 8, he says, now, therefore, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. God sent me here. And again, 45 verse 9, God has made me Lord over all of Egypt. And so Joseph very clearly recognizes after 22 years how it is that he's come to the position that he is, that God was with him. And so as you read through these chapters, again, just pay attention to that theme because I think that's the major faith lesson we're supposed to gain out of Genesis 37 through 47. Now, at the conclusion to that whole section, then, when we get down to the very end of chapter 47, what we see is Jacob and all his descendants and his whole household has moved to Egypt. And what we realize is Jacob, also known as Israel, so there's Israel the nation, but there's Israel the person. Jacob is Israel the person. Jacob has faith in God's promise for the future. So just to wrap up this section, listen to these words of Genesis 47, 27 through 31 that help us realize they've moved to Egypt, but Jacob knows there's more to the story to come. So it says in Genesis 47, 27, now Israel, here referring to the whole people of Israel, his descendants. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and they were fruitful and became very numerous, echoing the creation mandate in Genesis 1:26 to be fruitful and multiply. They did that, and they grew, and they became a great nation. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. And when the time for Israel, that is Jacob, to die drew near, he called his son Joseph to him and said, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place your hand under my thigh now and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. This is some sort of ceremony by which you take an oath, you make a pledge. And so that's what Jacob is asking Joseph to do. Put your hand under my thigh and swear by this. And he says, please, do not bury me in Egypt, but when I lie down with my fathers, when I die, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in my father's burial place. And Joseph said, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. So Joseph swore to him. Then Israel bowed down in worship at the head of his bed. And so as chapter 47 comes to a close, Jacob realizes the land of promise is to the north. We left there. We're living here. But I don't want to remain here and be buried here. I want to be buried in the land of promise with my fathers Abraham and Isaac. And so he makes Joseph swear. And we'll see in the last few chapters of Genesis how that all unfolds. But there's more to the story than just this family moving down to Egypt. And so as we wrap up this section, again, just to highlight that key theological theme, which is God is with Joseph, even in Egypt. That's important. He's with Joseph, even in Egypt. In fact, Stephen, when he gives his speech in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7, that's one of the things he highlights. God's not limited to the land of promise. He's not limited in Stephen's time period to the temple itself there in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. God was with Joseph in Egypt. And indeed, Joseph tells his brothers that God sent him there, as we noted, ahead of them in order to preserve their life. And what they meant for evil 20 years prior, God meant for good. In fact, we'll see that in chapter 50 where we get that famous line of Joseph. 20 plus years. And Joseph's prophetic dreams finally become a reality. It wasn't always easy, and things didn't go smoothly, and it wasn't this upwards into the right trajectory like Joseph would have expected or maybe hoped. But during that time, Joseph's trust in God clearly deepened. And Judah, Joseph's brother, as you read the account, well, he really did change too. And so God used all the events of the ensuing years from chapter 37 to chapter 47 to protect his promise and even change the hearts of his people, the people of promise, who had a lot of changing that needed to be done. And how does all this point towards Christ? Well, Joseph is the one who was rejected by the sons of Israel, who becomes Israel's deliverer and savior. Just as in a very more full and final way, Jesus is the exact same thing. In fact, that idea of people being rejected who becomes savior and deliverer, that pattern shows up, it seems, and replays itself at times over and over again through the Old Testament until it finally culminates in Christ. They're all like little partial snapshots or fuzzy snapshots of what will come full focus and full flower in the person of Jesus. And so just as the people who crucified Jesus meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, well, the same thing is true for Joseph in the story here we read in Genesis 37 through 47. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Genesis. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. In fact, I'm continually amazed by the kindness and the generosity of people who support this ministry. So thank you so much for your generous support of this ministry. If you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com and just click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, click that little box that says Make This Monthly. All those monies then will come to support this ministry so that more people can learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.